Hey folks, Colin here from Something's Recording, and today I'm going to show you a simple trick I use when referencing other tracks. Okay, so this is the session I've been working on. I just finished up a few tweaks on the mix, and I'm going to show you the EQ trick I use to reference professional masters, okay? So this is the mix bus is what my mix is coming through, and then these over here are my reference tracks. These two are actually the same, but since it's a cover, one is cut up and kind of lined up with the grid. The other one's just the track. And then these are the two reference tracks that I use when mixing and mastering, okay? So the mix bus and then these four reference tracks are all running to the main here, okay? And we're gonna put an EQ on the main. And what we're gonna do is we're gonna go tiny frequency range by tiny frequency range, and we're gonna compare each range to our mix and the professional master, okay? So we're gonna start with 50 hertz and below, and I like to do all of my referencing in mono. So down here in Studio One, if you click that, when it's a little red circle, that means you're in mono, and then when you see the two blue circles, that means you're in stereo. So we're gonna switch to mono here. This is just 50 hertz and below at a 12 dB per octave slope, and I'm gonna show you what my track sounds like and then what the reference track sounds like, okay? So we're gonna use this one here for the 50 hertz and below area, because this is the reference I use for the low end of the kick and the low end of the bass, okay? So here's our track. Usually you have to turn this up a little bit when it's 50 hertz and below too. So here's 50 hertz and below. Okay, so you can hear it's just the low end of the kick and the low end of the bass. So now we'll take a listen to the reference track, 50 hertz and below. So you can hear the reference has a little bit more below 50 on the bass and a little bit more below 50 on the kick. So we can just come over to our bass and put a little bit more below 50 there. Same thing with the kick. Got an EQ here. We can just come over and take this one here and put a little bit more at 50. Okay, so now we got the below 50 handled, and I would just take this and I would just go up and up, little frequency range by little frequency range. So next I would do 40 to 100. So I'll show you what that sounds like. Now bear in mind, I've already gone through and I've done this. I've tweaked the mix. I got it where I want it. So I'll show you what each frequency range sounds like in comparison to the professional master, okay? So make sure that's at 0 there. And then here is my mix. And again, I'm using the second reference track because it's what I like the low end of the kick and the low end of the bass on. So I just flip back and forth. And you can see both of them have a nice tight kick because I've listened to this reference track. I made sure my kick was just as tight and had just as much point around that 80 hertz area. And I just keep going up. So next I do 100 to about 250. This is where I would start using the first reference track because the vocal comes into play. And it gives me a good snare to reference against. Next I do 200 to 500, so here's what that sounds like. So you get that mid-range pop on the snare. Next I do 500 to about 1.5K. So that's your mid-range on the guitars or instruments. Next I do about 1K to 2.5K. So these are your high mids. So you can make sure your guitars aren't too harsh in that range. Next I do 2K to 5K. And this is where you can make sure your vocal's not too harsh. If you put too much in this area in your vocal, it'll be really pointy and a little bit sharp. And the final range I do, well, not the final range, I do actually do one more after this. So next I do 5K to 10K. So I get the high end on my vocal dialed in and the top end of my instruments in there. And I make sure on this second reference track that the top end of the kick and the top end of the snare are okay. You can make sure you don't have too much cymbal noise in there. And the final range I do is about 8K and up, okay? You can make sure your hi-hats aren't too wild. You can make sure your vocal sits nicely on the top end. And then the final thing I do is I do 100 to 10K. Now this is kind of like you see those old box speakers. They're just a mono speaker and they were really mid-rangey. A lot of people use those for a reference back in the day. It gives you a good idea what your mix is going to sound like through an old radio or through a mono Bluetooth speaker. So I do 100 to 10K and I make sure my mix sounds okay there. And this will give you a good idea if your kick and your bass are sitting nicely from 100 up. Because you focus on your 100 down when you're in your mix, you get that 80 right on your bass, you get that 60 and 70 right on your kick. But if you can't hear that from 100 and up, it's not going to sound right on those smaller speakers, okay? So that is the EQ trick, so I'll turn that off, and I'll give you a preview of what this track sounds like. Okay? So here is the finished, mixed, and mastered track, okay? This is the fourth verse going into the re-intro. So that's it. Thanks so much for watching. I hope that's helpful. Try it on your next mix, pull in a professional master, and use the EQ trick to compare your song to the professional master, okay? Let me know down in the comments if that helps you, and I will see you guys in the next video.